So welcome. Thank you for joining us. Happy New Year. 2022 was a really important year for redistricting efforts. We certainly didn't get the reforms accomplished that we were looking for, but we did put a lot of pressure to have a much more transparent process, to have much more public input, and to end up with much better maps. So kudos to all of you who were involved in this fight in 2022 and beyond. And I know some of you have been working on redistricting reform for a very long time. I've been working on it since the tail end of 2015. Fair Districts PA began in January of 2016. So we are celebrating our 7th birthday, I believe. Yes, 7th birthday for Fair Districts PA. So for some of us, we've been working on redistricting reform for 7 years, but I'm asking you as we get started to put in the chat where you're located, and also a bipartisan solution you've been working for and how long. So for some of you, you came into this with redistricting reform top of mind. Most of us, though, as I've said in many meetings across the state, most of us don't wake up and say, redistricting reform, that really matters to me. Most of us get interested in this issue because of something else. And for me, I was a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor for 11 years in a fairly affluent church in a fairly affluent community in the main line of Pennsylvania with a partner parish in one of the poorest communities in Philadelphia. And we spent a lot of time with kids in both parishes, both churches. And what I realized was the kids in the affluent community had all the resources that they could possibly want in their schools. They had counselors, they had libraries, they had I went to their school plays. I went to lots of school plays. And in some of the schools, every single kid would have a lapel mic. The kids in Kensington, that was the other church that I worked with, the kids in Kensington didn't have an auditorium, and they didn't have a library, and they didn't have a full-time counselor. These are kids who had trauma, who had neglect, who had all kinds of problems. And many of them, I was the only adult that they knew, and the pastor in their church. We were the only adults they knew who had gone to college. How are they even going to figure out how to apply to college if they don't know adults who went there? And yet they didn't have access to the kinds of things that they needed. I spent 11 years watching that, mulling over the absolute injustice, but also the absolute stupidity of a system that allowed that kind of neglect of whether you want those kids to grow up to have a full life, or whether you're just thinking about workforce development. Either way, it's just bad policy. And so in looking at bad policy, I began to look for who understands these things and is working to address them. And I came across the League of Women Voters. And the League of Women Voters, I discovered people who had been working on school funding inequity in Pennsylvania for 20 years. People who had been concerned about the ridiculous dependence on property tax that put a great burden on poor communities and on aging homeowners, and left poor communities underfunded and struggling. I found people who'd been working on that since the 1990s. And so then I began to say, well, why is that the case? And people said, oh, redistricting, which is the first time I heard the word redistricting, and began looking at redistricting. But as you know, as we've looked at redistricting, we've discovered another problem that is tightly related to gerrymandered districts and an unaccountable legislature. So we have an unaccountable legislature held in place by 30 years of gerrymandered districts. But as we discovered, as we watched a bill that had more co-sponsors than any other get buried, as we watched bills get gutted without 24 hours notice, as we watched things that people just said, how is that legal? How do they get away with that? Legislators, past legislators, current legislators said, you know what, you're going to have to look at the legislative rules. You're going to have to dig in and understand the rules, understand how the rules make it impossible for bipartisan solutions to move forward. And legislators from both parties in both chambers, some of them will say, oh, it's fine as it is. The minute you start talking about their own bills, they'll start talking about how the system is broken. Our legislative process is broken. Good bills introduced year after year after year don't go anywhere. So as I've asked you to do, and if you haven't done it, go ahead and do it, put in chat where you're located, but also the bipartisan solution that brought you to thinking about legislative rules, or to, the bipartisan problem, the issue, the concern that got you thinking about the state legislature in the first place? And I'll be honest, I never thought about state legislatures at all until I got into the question about school funding and said, who decides this stuff? And why are they making such dumb decisions? And why are they leaving these kids so neglected? And then I began to dig into state government, and I realized our state government impacts every single one of us every single day in so many more ways than we realize. Things like property tax, things like school funding, things like, does your grandchild or your child's daycare center have a carbon monoxide detector? Things like that. So there's so many issues that are impacted by our state legislature and by the procedural rules that are involved. So you've been putting some answers in chat, and what we see as we look at this is that there's a mix of rules. For many of you, you've been looking at funding for schools. For some of you, you've been looking at redistricting. Those of you who said redistricting, though, think back. What was it before redistricting that got you interested? Because everybody I've ever talked to, redistricting was because there was something before that. They realized that their legislator couldn't represent them because, or that there was something that they wanted to happen that wasn't happening because of gerrymandered districts. Environmental reform, other kinds of government reform. And, the gift ban was one this year that we were watching closely. Pennsylvania is one of just a very few states that does not have a gift ban, where our legislators are allowed to accept gifts of all kinds. They can get Super Bowl tickets. They can get trips to the wine country of France. They can be taken out to dinner every single day by lobbyists, and there's no rules against that. And that is, again, another issue that doesn't go anywhere because of legislative rules. So again, think about your own story, your own concerns, and how those issues are held hostage by a legislature that doesn't allow bipartisan solutions to get a vote. As I mentioned, my own school funding, and then the League of Women Voters has been working on a whole host of issues. As I began to know people who've been involved with the League of Women Voters, and I got involved in my local league, but then I ended up on the board of the state league in charge of issues, government and social policy, and that's like a swirl of issues that the league has been working on for years and years. So I discovered the league advocated for redistricting reform introduced back in the 1980s, school funding, as I said, going back to the 1990s, environmental concerns. The league started a project. I don't know if you're all aware of it. They started a project called it's on shale impact. A straight scoop on shale was started back in the I believe in 2010 or 2011. And the reason for that, interesting to find out, is because the state legislature basically was blocking collection of information on the health impacts of the shale industry. So instead of the state legislature saying, our job is to make sure that we're collecting health data, so if there are concerns, we're ready to legislate and regulate. No, our state legislature, held hostage by shale money, shale donor money, shale lobby money, shale contribution money, our state legislature said, not only are we not going to collect health information, we're going to block the collection of health information. So the League of Women Voters started the Straight Scoop on Shale to hold, to begin to collect that information in a different way, and has held a state conference on the health impacts of the shale industry every year for over a decade, and actually became an international leader in collecting that data before there were other organizations that stepped in and began to do the same thing. So health organizations in Pennsylvania who were saying, we're seeing things, who do we tell? The state legislature said, tell nobody. In fact, they were passing legislation to block the telling of anybody. And the League of Women Voters stepped in to say, tell us, come to our conference and tell us, because we need to know. And that information continues to accumulate, and our state legislature continues to refuse to do anything about that information. So that's another. As I got involved with the League, we became concerned about all of these issues, but also redistricting reform. And it became clear from legislators, I've told the story, but I'll tell it briefly again here. In 2015, I was invited along with the president of the league, of the state league at that time, Susan Carty, to a meeting with legislators and policy staff in Senator Lisa Boscola's office. I had never been in the Capitol. I had never met a state senator. I didn't own a suit, and I honestly knew very little about redistricting, but I was invited to this meeting and I went, and the legislators talked about their interest in passing a constitutional amendment to create an independent citizens redistricting commission. They were talking about how California had done that, led by Republican governor. Now his name is going to escape me. Their Republican governor, Schwarzenegger, had been the prime a force behind that, but the League of Women Voters and Common Cause had also been very active in getting that independent citizens redistricting commission in place. And the fruit of that was far better representation and a legislature that was much more accountable to the people of California. So our legislators in both chambers and in both parties were looking at that saying, oh my, what if we could do that here in Pennsylvania? What if we could actually have maps that reflected the people of Pennsylvania and allowed for a more accountable legislature? These are legislators who wanted to do this, invited advocates to come to their first meeting to talk about what that bill would be and how to get it passed. And toward the end of that meeting, one of them looked at us and said, unless the advocates are very loud, this will never happen, which was a shock to me, a surprise to me, and I've been trying to understand ever since why that would be the case when legislators themselves are saying that unless the advocates are loud, the legislators themselves have no ability to represent the people of Pennsylvania to accomplish a reform of that importance. And what we've seen is that in truth, they don't have the ability to do that. One committee chair elected by less than 2% or less than 0.5% of Pennsylvanians can block a bill. One majority leader can block a bill. And as we've seen, half of the bills that come out of one chamber are blocked by the other chamber. Half of the bills passed by the Senate are blocked by the House. Half the bills passed from the House are blocked by the Senate. And that's with the same party in leadership in both chambers. In both chambers have been led by GOP leadership for 12 years, for a large number of the last 30 years. And even then, one chamber will block the bills from the other. So it's not just a partisan issue, it's also a pettiness issue, and it's also a territorial issue of one chamber saying, we don't want the Senate to get the credit for this, or the Senate saying, we don't want the House to get the credit for this. But we've also heard about committee chairs who just say, oh, we don't ever look at a bill on that topic, or I'll never look at a bill introduced by the minority party, or that person really made me mad 6 years ago, so we're not going to look at that bill, or that person tried a discharge petition 10 years ago. We're never going to look at their bill. Even when the person who introduced the bill realizes, okay, my bill introduced by me is never going to go anywhere, so I'm going to get somebody else, a friend in the other party, a friend in that committee, to introduce the bill. Even when that happens, those bills often go nowhere because the committee chair says, I know whose bill that is. That bill was introduced by that person 8 years ago. We're not going to give it a vote. It's that petty. It's that personal. It's that dysfunctional. So what are we saying? We are saying that bipartisan solutions deserve a vote. We are saying that if there's demonstrated bipartisan support for a bill, that bill should have a vote. Now, what do you mean by bipartisan support? There's different resolutions that have been introduced to address this. One is that any bill that gets 20 co-sponsors from both parties in the House should get a vote. So any bill introduced in the Senate with 5 or 6 co-sponsors from each party should get a vote. Another is the Representative Steve Samuelson. He had the most co-sponsors on a bill in 2008 for redistricting reform. He had 110 co-sponsors for a bill for redistricting reform in 2018. So he's seen he has seen bills with huge bipartisan support get blocked. In the 2008 one, it was a Democratic committee chair. In the 2018, it was a Republican committee chair. Basically, his thing is, if you can get the most co-sponsors of a bill in that session, or if you can get a majority of legislators to co-sponsor a bill, surely that bill should get a vote. That's a different way to do it. Another possibility is a priority bill, so that every legislator can have a bill that if they could demonstrate even 5 co-sponsors from each chamber, each party, that bill would get moved for a vote. There's different ways to do that. Our request is that they find a way to do that. And Actually, another way is discharge petitions, if they function properly, would give legislators a way to move a bill if a committee chair blocks it. Our current discharge petition does not work, hasn't worked in years, but there's different ways to do it. Our request is find a way to make sure that bipartisan solutions get a vote in committee. If a bill comes out of committee with bipartisan support, that is demonstrated support from both sides, and that doesn't mean one vote from the other side, it means several votes at least from the other side. If it comes out of committee with bipartisan support, it should be guaranteed a vote on the chamber floor. And for sure, if a bill comes out of one chamber with bipartisan support, it should be guaranteed a vote in the other chamber. I'll give you one quick example. Carbon monoxide. In 2021, there was a situation in Allentown where there was a daycare center that had carbon monoxide poisoning, 27 children, one daycare worker. Fortunately, they recognized what was happening and got them to the hospital. There are people who die from carbon monoxide poisoning. There are people who have severe lasting problems from carbon monoxide poisoning, and the symptoms are bizarre. So it's hard to know. Sometimes it looks like people have food poisoning. It can look like a lot of different things. They could have easily said, oh, the kids must have eaten something. Let's just put them down for a nap. They could have lost children if they had done that. Fortunately, that's not what happened. But Pennsylvania does not have a requirement that daycare centers have carbon monoxide detectors. Senator Fontana has introduced bills on this issue every session for a number of years. In 3 separate sessions, 3 consecutive sessions, the Senate unanimously has passed his bill. Has passed a bill to require carbon monoxide detectors in daycare centers. So imagine the Senate passes a bill saying carbon monoxide detectors in daycare centers, that's a no-brainer. They don't cost much, what, $20 a carbon monoxide detector? You've got children's lives at risk. Of course, why wouldn't you pass this? The House Committee Chair, the House Health Committee Chair says, no, that's government overreach. Government overreach requiring carbon monoxide detectors in daycare centers. We're not going to give that a vote. The bill goes nowhere. There is still not a requirement for carbon monoxide detectors in daycare centers. That's one example. I could give you many, many examples of just why would you not do this? And one committee chair can say, I don't like that. I don't believe in that. That's not what I think. And that decides it. It goes nowhere. And so our question is, why would we allow a system where one committee chair elected by less than 0.5% of Pennsylvanians is allowed to block a bill that the average Pennsylvanian would say, are you kidding me? They don't have that already? How is that possible? So in many, many ways, Pennsylvania is held hostage by a really bad legislative system. And people will say, well, passing more bills is not always a good thing. That's true. Not every bill is created equal, but Pennsylvania is riddled with legislative mandates that make no sense, that are expensive, that hold us back. And we have lots of laws that haven't been revised, haven't been considered, haven't been reviewed in a century or half of a century. And there are many organizations who put out reports saying, this is a problem. We need to fix it. I'll give you another quick example. Regionalization of firefighters. Back in 1976, there was a report called Pennsylvania Burning. That's a pretty stark title for a report. A government report doesn't usually have a title like Pennsylvania Burning, but what they wanted to say is this is a problem. Pennsylvania has trouble funding and staffing our volunteer firefighters, and they need to be regionalized. This report gave very specific recommendations. None of those recommendations happened. In 2004, there was another report that said, our firefighters are in crisis. This is a crisis. It needs to be addressed. Here are recommendations to do that. They didn't happen. Another report in the teens, again, saying, all caps, this is a crisis. We need to regionalize our firefighters. And there's a little nibble here, a little nibble there, a little adjustment there, but the most of the recommendations are just ignored. And this is like cut and paste. I mean, they're giving you the language. Take this language, put it in a bill, introduce it, pass it. The same committees that actually recommend these reports then take the reports and do nothing with them. Now, people will say, well, there is regionalization of firefighters going on. Yes, but it's very difficult and lots and lots and lots of legislative hurdles and legal hurdles. And that's the case in many areas in Pennsylvania life right now. You can make it work, you can move forward, but the legislative framework we have actually works against you instead of helping you. Pennsylvania could thrive if we had a legislative framework that worked for the people of Pennsylvania, that worked for our communities, that worked for our counties, and county commissioners, township supervisors, Farm Bureau, Center for Rural Pennsylvania. We could go on and on and on about the entities that regularly make recommendations, and most of those recommendations are ignored. So what we want bipartisan solutions to get a vote. What we're asking our legislators tomorrow is if the rules that are put forward are not better, vote no. If the rules that are put forward do not allow bipartisan solutions to get a vote in committee, on the chamber floor, and in the other chamber, vote no. And also, in the past, those rules have been given to our legislators sometimes an hour before the vote, sometimes half an hour before the vote. Now, tomorrow is swearing in day. Most of our legislators will have guests there. They'll have family there. New legislators will bring busloads of their supporters, people who helped them get elected. This is a ceremonial day. Do you think they're going to sit down half an hour before session starts and read the rules? No. So we're saying if you haven't had 24 hours to review the rules and to discuss them with your colleagues, vote no. Just say no. There's no reason that the leadership would just hand them the rules right before and say, here you are, vote for these. If they don't start now by saying that's not the way we're going to operate, then they're not going to be able to represent us. We're going to have 2 more years without representation. So we're saying vote no. If the rules take away your right to represent us, vote no. And vote no if you don't have time to review and to discuss those rules. So how can you help? That's what we're here to do. We're launching our 24-hour virtual rally. Some of us will be on the Capitol steps tomorrow at 11 with that message. We will have some speakers from different parts of Pennsylvania and different parts of Pennsylvania life. We'll have a farmer talking about how this impacts farmers. We'll have somebody from the health professions talking about how this impacts the health professions. We'll have somebody from longstanding advocacy organizations talking about the years of work that they've been doing. We'll have somebody talking about gun safety and how that's been shut out completely, even though a majority of Pennsylvanians say common sense gun safety bills, yeah, why not give them a vote? And we'll have a couple of our Fair Districts PA speakers talking about this from some different angles and what we've been learning about the rules. So we'll be on the Capitol steps tomorrow. We'll also have a group of folks hand delivering postcards to every legislative office with the message of vote no for rules that take away your right to represent us. One thing I meant to mention was how our legislature compares to other states very badly. When we look at our neighbor states, even a neighbor state like Maryland, which has a 3-month legislative session, Maryland passed almost 3 times the bills Pennsylvania did in the 3-month session this year. So states around us, I spent some time living in Virginia, and I was interested because Virginia is a commonwealth like Pennsylvania, and they went to regionalized everything almost a century ago. So education is less fractured, firefighters are less fractured, library systems are less fractured. All of that was done by the state legislature to end the fragmentation, which is very, very costly and very, very inefficient. Pennsylvania is currently the most fragmented and fractured state in the country in terms of various jurisdictions, overlapping entities, and the ways to fund those is incredibly complicated and incredibly costly. So back to what we can do. We can help our legislators understand that the status quo is not working. So if you go to the Fair Districts PA website and look at the updates, and if somebody could just throw the link, yeah, there it is. Ruth Geiser has already beat me to it. If you look at the last comment in the chat, there's a link to our recent update. And so there's information about how to contact your legislator. So as part of our virtual rally, we're asking you to contact legislators between now and tomorrow morning and to say, vote no to give them the message. That message, ideas for what to say are on that website. And we would say, if you know who your legislators are, you might already know where your legislators stand on this. So if you have a state rep who has said, this is a no-brainer, of course we want to fix the rules, don't call that person. Make sure you work your way down the list of legislative leaders and call them. If you have a newly elected legislator that you've already talked to, you might send them a quick thanks for paying attention to this, but focus more on the legislative leaders. If you have newly elected folks who have not been interested in this topic, or you have legislators who've said the status quo is fine, stop bothering me, or if you have legislators who don't respond at all, contact them and encourage your neighbors to contact them. Get as many folks as you can to contact them. So decide where your energy is going to go based on what you know about your own legislators. And again, when it comes to the leadership, we know that the Democratic leadership has expressed interest, at least talking about this. We know the Democratic caucuses have been discussing rules for weeks. And we know that there are resolutions from Democratic legislators in both chambers that they'll introduce if the rules aren't changed. We know that the Republican leadership has flatly refused to discuss this. So when you think about where to put your energy, think about, who most needs to hear that this is a problem and this really does need to be addressed. So contacting legislators is a top priority. Another priority, though, is outreach on social media. And a lot of our legislative leaders have thought, you know what? We just do what we want and nobody really pays attention and nobody really knows. And we're just going to keep doing what we want. And if anybody complains, we're going to say, you don't understand it. It's complicated. It takes time. Back off. Let us do our jobs. And what we want to say is, no, we do understand it. We're actually smarter than you think. And we're more tenacious than you think. And our neighbors are too. And when we started Fair Districts PA, people said, you know what? Leaders will never give up power and the people of Pennsylvania will never pay attention. We will not have the leaders give up power until more and more and more people of Pennsylvania do pay attention. So thank you all for being here on short notice to think about this, but also think about ways that you can help other people reach out and say something. So if you've got friends who are on social media, encourage them to help spread the word. If you're on social media, spread the word. There's different ideas. There are different ways to do that. They're listed again on that link that Ruth Yeiser shared. We have a new TikTok. Actually, we have 2 new TikTok accounts. So if you're on TikTok, go and look there's a Fix Harrisburg TikTok and a Fair Districts PA TikTok. We've got lots of Fair Districts PA local accounts. We've got the state account. So any interaction you can do with those or sharing of those. We've got the Fix Harrisburg Twitter account and the Fair Districts PA Twitter account and some local Twitter accounts as well. We've got a Fix Harrisburg Instagram account. So any ways that you can share that. It's interesting how you might just hit a thread where suddenly things just begin to share and more people see it. Whatever you can do to help spread the word is really important, really valuable. And the more hashtag Fix Harrisburg we can put out into the social media world between now and tomorrow, the better. What we want to say is, Pennsylvania people are not happy with the status quo. We are demanding something better. We are not going away. We will not be quiet. And every move you make in this legislative session, we'll be watching you. So let me just say, getting the rules changed is a heavy lift. It might not happen tomorrow, but we know there's a divided leadership in the House. So we know this conversation will not end tomorrow in the House. It will continue. And it might be that we don't get changes tomorrow, but we keep hammering away. And by the time the leadership finally is resolved after special elections, whenever those happen, it might be at that point they say, okay, we've been hearing from them every day. Let's do something about the rules. It might also be that the Senate is looking and saying, you know what? We had trouble getting things passed when the House was led by Republicans. Now it's going to be a mess for months. Let's just put some better rules in place so we can actually get something done. You never know. So this is an interesting year, but the one last thing I wanted to say about the possibility of change is we did not get redistricting reform legislation passed, but the fact of public attention forced better maps. So we might not get better rules in place right now, but the better attention might force a better legislative process as we go through this new year. Eventually, we want to see rules, procedural rules in law, so that leaders can't just jimmy them behind closed doors at the start of each session. That we need some good rules in law, just as we need redistricting reform in law. But in the meantime, enough public attention can force better behavior, even if we don't have the rules in law. So that's our goal.